Silver Blaze. "I'm afraid, Watson, I have to go," Holmes declared as we sat down for breakfast one morning. "Go? Where to?" I asked, surprised. "To Dartmoor, to King's Pyland," he replied, his gaze distant. I wasn't surprised. I was just curious why he hadn't already gotten involved in this strange case, the one everyone in England was talking about. For a whole day, Holmes had been pacing the room, chin on his chest, brows furrowed, constantly refilling his pipe with the strongest tobacco, completely ignoring my attempts to chat. Fresh newspapers arrived, but he only glanced at them before throwing them in a corner. Despite his silence, I knew what was on his mind. There was only one case that could capture his attention: the strange disappearance of the Wessex Cup favorite, and the tragic murder of its trainer. So, when he finally announced his decision to go to the scene, it was exactly what I expected and hoped for. "I'd be happy to go with you if you don't mind," I offered. "My dear Watson, you'd be doing me a huge favor, and I think your time won't be wasted, because this case has some very unusual aspects. We have just enough time to catch the train at Paddington, and I'll tell you more about it on our journey. Could you bring your excellent field glasses?" And so, an hour or so later, I found myself in a first-class carriage speeding towards Exeter, while Sherlock Holmes, his sharp, eager face framed by his traveling cap, diligently scanned the stack of fresh newspapers he'd bought at Paddington. We had left Reading far behind before he finished reading and offered me his cigar case. "We're making good time," he said, looking out the window and checking his watch. "We're going at 53.5 miles per hour. "I haven't been paying attention to the mile markers," I admitted. "Nor have I, but the telegraph poles along this line are 60 yards apart, and the math is simple. I assume you've read about the murder of John Straker and the disappearance of Silver Blaze?" "I've seen what the Telegraph and the Chronicle have to say," I replied. "This is one of those cases where a detective's skills are needed more for sorting through details than finding new clues. This tragedy is so unusual, so complete, and so important to so many people that we're swamped with guesswork, theories, and assumptions. The challenge is to separate the facts, absolute, undeniable facts, from the opinions and interpretations of those who are trying to solve it. Once we have a solid foundation of facts, then we can figure out what they mean and identify the key points of the mystery." On Tuesday evening, I received telegrams from both Colonel Ross, the owner of the horse, and Inspector Gregory, who is investigating the case, asking for my help. "Tuesday evening?" I exclaimed. "And this is Thursday morning. Why didn't you go yesterday?" "Because I made a mistake, my dear Watson, which I'm afraid happens more often than people who only know me through your memoirs would think. The truth is, I couldn't believe that the most famous horse in England could stay hidden for long, especially in such a remote place as the north of Dartmoor. Every hour yesterday, I expected to hear that he had been found, and that his kidnapper was also the murderer of John Straker. When another morning came, and I realized that nothing had been done except for the arrest of young Fitzroy Simpson, I knew it was time for me to step in. But, in a way, I don't regret waiting." "You have a theory, then?" I asked, intrigued. "At least, I've got a handle on the important facts. I'll explain them to you, because nothing helps solve a case more than talking it through with someone else. And I can't expect you to help if I don't show you where we're starting from." I leaned back, puffing on my cigar, while Holmes, leaning forward, his long finger tracing the points on his palm, gave me a rundown of what had happened. "Silver Blaze," he began, "is from the isonomy line and has an impressive record, just like his famous ancestor. He's 5 years old now, and he's won every major racing prize for Colonel Ross, his lucky owner. Until the recent tragedy, he was the favorite for the Wessex Cup, with odds of 3-1 on him. But he's always been popular with the public and has never let them down, so even at those odds, a lot of money was wagered on him. Clearly, a lot of people had a strong reason to make sure Silver Blaze wasn't there when the race started next Tuesday. Of course, this was understood at King's Pyland, where the Colonel's stables are. They took every precaution to protect the favorite. The trainer, John Straker, is a retired jockey who used to ride in Colonel Ross's colors before he got too heavy. He's been with the Colonel for 5 years as a jockey and 7 years as a trainer, and he's always been a dedicated and honest worker. He had 3 young men working for him. The stable was small, only 4 horses in total. One of the boys stayed up at night in the stable, while the others slept in the loft. All 3 were good kids. John Straker, who is married, lived in a small house about 200 yards from the stables. He has no children, keeps 1 maid, and is comfortably off. The surrounding area is very isolated, but about half a mile to the north, there's a group of small houses built by a contractor from Tavistock for people who want to enjoy the fresh air of Dartmoor. Tavistock itself is 2 miles west, and across the moor, also 2 miles away, is the larger training establishment of Mapleton, which belongs to Lord Backwater and is run by Silas Brown. In every other direction, the moor is a wild, empty place, with just a few wandering gypsies. This was the situation last Monday night, when the terrible event happened. That evening, the horses were exercised and watered as usual, and the stables were locked up at 9 o'clock. 2 of the boys walked up to the trainer's house for supper in the kitchen, while the third, Ned Hunter, stayed on guard. A few minutes after 9, the maid, Edith Baxter, took down Ned's supper, which was curried mutton. She didn't take any liquid because there was a water tap in the stables, and the rule was for the boy on duty to only drink water. She carried a lantern with her because it was very dark, and the path crossed the open moor. Edith Baxter was within 30 yards of the stables when a man appeared out of the darkness and called to her to stop. When he stepped into the light of her lantern, she saw a gentlemanly-looking person, dressed in a gray tweed suit with a cap. He was wearing gaiters and carrying a heavy stick with a knob on it. But what really impressed her was how pale he was and how nervous he seemed. She thought he was probably a bit over 30. "Can you tell me where I am?" he asked. "I was about to sleep on the moor when I saw the light of your lantern." "You're near the King's Pyland stables," she replied. "Oh, really? What a stroke of luck!" he exclaimed. "I hear a stable boy sleeps here alone every night. Maybe that's his supper you're taking to him. Now, I'm sure you wouldn't mind earning the price of a new dress, would you?" He pulled a piece of white paper out of his pocket. "Make sure the boy gets this tonight, and you'll have the prettiest frock money can buy." She was scared by how seriously he was talking and ran past him to the window where she usually gave the meals. It was already open, and Hunter was sitting at the small table inside. She started to tell him what had happened when the stranger came up again. "Good evening," he said, looking through the window. "I wanted to have a word with you." The girl has sworn that as he spoke, she saw a corner of the paper sticking out of his closed hand. "What business do you have here?" asked the boy. "It's business that might put something in your pocket," said the other. "You've got 2 horses in for the Wessex Cup, Silver Blaze and Bayard. Tell me the truth and you won't lose. Is it true that at the weights, Bayard could give the other 100 yards in 5 furlongs, and that the stable has bet on him?" "So you're one of those damned touts," cried the lad. "I'll show you how we deal with them in King's Pyland." He jumped up and ran across the stable to let the dog loose. The girl ran back to the house, but as she ran, she looked back and saw the stranger leaning through the window. A minute later, though, When Hunter ran out with the dog, he was gone. Even though Hunter ran all around the buildings, he couldn't find any trace of him. "Wait a minute," I interrupted. "When the stable boy ran out with the dog, did he leave the door unlocked behind him?" "Excellent, Watson, excellent!" my companion exclaimed. The importance of that point hit me so hard that I sent a special telegram to Dartmoor yesterday to get it cleared up. The boy locked the door before he left. The window, I might add, was too small for a man to get through. Hunter waited until the other grooms had come back. Then he sent a message to the trainer and told him what had happened. Straker was upset to hear the story, even though he didn't seem to realize how serious it was. But it made him uneasy, and Mrs. Straker, waking up at 1 in the morning, found him getting dressed. When she asked him what was going on, he said he couldn't sleep because he was worried about the horses, and he was going to walk down to the stables to check everything was all right. She begged him to stay home, as she could hear the rain beating against the window. But despite her pleas, he put on his raincoat and left. Mrs. Straker woke up at 7 in the morning to find her husband still wasn't back. She got dressed quickly, called the maid, and went to the stables. The door was open. Inside, huddled on a chair, Hunter was in a deep sleep. The favorite stall was empty, and there was no sign of the trainer. The two boys who slept in the hayloft above the harness room were woken up quickly. They hadn't heard anything during the night because they're both heavy sleepers. Hunter was clearly under the influence of a strong drug, and since he was completely out of it, they let him sleep while the two boys and the two women ran out to look for the missing people. They were still hoping that the trainer had taken the horse out for an early workout. But when they went up to the hill near the house, where they could see all the surrounding moors, they didn't see any sign of the horse, and they found something that made them realize a terrible tragedy had happened. About a quarter of a mile from the stables, John Straker's coat was hanging from a gorse bush. Just beyond, there was a bowl-shaped dip in the moor, and at the bottom of this, they found the trainer's body. His head had been crushed by a heavy blow, and he had a deep cut on his thigh, obviously made by a very sharp object. It was clear, though, that Straker had fought back against his attackers, because he was holding a small knife in his right hand, covered in blood up to the handle, and in his left hand he was clutching a red and black silk scarf, which the maid recognized as the one the stranger was wearing the night before, when he visited the stables. Hunter, when he woke up, was also certain that the scarf was the stranger's. He was equally sure that the same man had drugged his curried mutton while standing at the window, leaving the stables unguarded. As for the missing horse, there was plenty of evidence in the mud at the bottom of the dip that he had been there during the fight. But from that morning on, he vanished. And although a big reward was offered, and all the gypsies on Dartmoor were on the lookout, there was no news of him. Finally, tests showed that the leftover supper the stable boy had eaten contained a significant amount of powdered opium, while the people at the house had eaten the same food that night without any problems. Those are the main facts of the case, stripped of any guesses and told as simply as possible. Now, I'll summarize what the police have done. Inspector Gregory, who's in charge of the case, is a very capable officer. If he just had a little imagination, he could be an amazing detective. As soon as he arrived, he found and arrested the man who was the obvious suspect. It wasn't hard to find him, because he lived in one of the houses I mentioned. His name is Fitzroy Simpson. He's from a good family, well-educated, but he's wasted a fortune on gambling. He now makes a living quietly, betting on races at the clubs in London. A look at his betting book shows that he had placed bets totaling £5,000 against the favorite horse. When he was arrested, He said he had come to Dartmoor to get some information about the King's Pyland horses, and also about Desborough, the second favorite, who was in Silas Brown's care at the Mapleton stables. He didn't try to deny that he had done what was described the night before, but said he didn't have any bad intentions and just wanted to get information directly from the source. When they showed him the scarf, he turned pale and couldn't explain why it was in the dead man's hand. His wet clothes showed he had been out in the storm the night before, and his stick, a heavy, weighted one, was just the kind of weapon that could have caused the terrible injuries the trainer received. On the other hand, he didn't have any wounds, while the state of Straker's knife suggests that at least one of his attackers must have been injured. There you have it, Watson, in a nutshell. If you can shed any light on this, I'd be grateful. I had listened with great interest to Holmes's clear explanation. Although I knew most of the facts, I hadn't fully understood their importance or how they were connected. Could it be, I suggested, that the stab wound on Straker might have been caused by his own knife during the convulsions after a head injury? It's more than possible. It's likely, Holmes said. If that's the case, one of the main points in the accused man's favor disappears. But even now, I said, I still don't understand what the police think happened. I'm afraid that no matter what theory we come up with, there will be problems with it, replied my companion. The police seem to think that Fitzroy Simpson, having drugged the boy and somehow getting a key, opened the stables and took the horse, probably intending to kidnap him. The horse's bridle is missing, so Simpson must have put it on. Then, having left the door open behind him, he was leading the horse across the moor when he either met or was overtaken by the trainer. A fight would have started naturally. Simpson beat the trainer's brains out with his heavy stick without getting hurt by the small knife Straker was using to defend himself. Then, the thief either took the horse to a secret hiding place, or maybe it ran away during the fight and is wandering around the moors now. That's what the police think, and as unlikely as it sounds, every other explanation is even less likely. But I'll be able to test that theory soon enough when we get there. Until then, I can't see how we can make much progress. It was evening by the time we arrived in the small town of Tavistock, nestled in the heart of Dartmoor. Two gentlemen were waiting for us at the station. One was tall, with fair hair and beard and piercing blue eyes. The other was a short, lively man, very neat and well-dressed, with a neatly trimmed mustache and an eyeglass. The latter was Colonel Ross, the famous sportsman. The other was Inspector Gregory, a rising star in the English detective force. "I'm so glad you've come down, Mr. Holmes," said the colonel. "The inspector has done everything he could think of, but I want to leave no stone unturned in avenging poor Straker and finding my horse." "Have there been any new developments?" Holmes asked. "I'm sorry to say that we haven't made much progress," said the inspector. "We have a carriage waiting outside, and as you probably want to see the place before it gets dark, we can talk about it on the way." A minute later, we were all seated in a comfortable carriage, rolling through the quaint old Devonshire town. Inspector Gregory was full of his case, and he kept talking, while Holmes occasionally asked a question or made a comment. Colonel Ross leaned back, arms crossed, hat pulled low over his eyes, as I listened intently to the conversation between the two detectives. Gregory was laying out his theory, which was almost exactly the same as what Holmes had predicted on the train. "We've got Fitzroy Simpson pretty much cornered," he said, sounding confident. "I believe he's the one. But I have to admit, the evidence is circumstantial, and something new could easily turn things around." "What about Straker's knife?" Holmes asked. "We're pretty sure he wounded himself in his fall." "My friend Dr. Watson made that suggestion as we came down. If that's true, it would be bad news for Simpson." "Definitely. He doesn't have a knife, and there's no sign of a wound on him. The evidence against him is pretty strong. He had a strong motivation to see the favorite horse disappear. He's suspected of poisoning the stable boy. He was definitely out in the storm. He was carrying a heavy stick, and his scarf was found in the dead man's hand. I think we have enough to take him to court." Holmes shook his head. "A good lawyer would tear it apart," he said. "Why would he take the horse out of the stables? If he wanted to hurt the horse, why couldn't he do it there? Has a duplicate key been found in his possession? What chemist sold him the opium? And most importantly, how could he, a stranger to the area, hide a horse, especially a horse like that? What's his explanation for the note he wanted the maid to give the stable boy?" "He says it was a 10-pound note. They found one in his wallet. But your other points aren't as difficult as they seem. He's not a stranger to the area. He's stayed in Tavistock twice during the summer. The opium probably came from London. The key would have been thrown away after it was used. The horse might be at the bottom of one of the old mines on the moor. What does he say about the scarf?" "He admits it's his and claims he lost it. But something new has come to light that might explain why he led the horse out of the stables." Holmes's ears perked up. "We found evidence that a group of gypsies camped on Monday night, within a mile of where the murder took place. They were gone by Tuesday. Now, if we assume Simpson had some kind of arrangement with these gypsies, maybe he was leading the horse to them when he was stopped, and maybe they have the horse now." "That's certainly possible," the inspector agreed. "The whole moor is being searched for these gypsies. I've also looked in every stable and outbuilding in Tavistock and the surrounding area for miles." "There's another training stable nearby, I understand?" Holmes said, his voice low and thoughtful. "Yes, and we can't ignore that. Since Desborough, their horse, was second in the betting, they had a reason to want the favorite to disappear. Silas Brown, the trainer, is known to have bet a lot on the race, and he wasn't friends with poor Straker. But we've checked their stables, and there's nothing that connects them to the crime." "And there's nothing to connect Simpson to the Mapleton stables?" "Nothing at all." Holmes leaned back in the carriage, his expression unreadable, and the conversation stopped. A few minutes later, our driver pulled up in front of a neat little red brick house with a porch. A little way off, across a field, was a long, gray-tiled building. In every other direction, the rolling hills of the moor, brown from the dying ferns, stretched away to the horizon, interrupted only by the church towers of Tavistock and the group of houses in the distance that marked the Mapleton stables. We all got out, except for Holmes. He stayed seated, his eyes fixed on the sky, completely lost in thought. It was only when I touched his arm that he startled awake and stepped out of the carriage, his gaze now focused on the scene before him. 4 days later, Holmes and I were back on the train, headed to Winchester for the Wessex Cup race. Colonel Ross was waiting for us outside the station, just like he said he would. We climbed into his fancy carriage and drove out of town towards the racecourse. The colonel looked serious, almost cold and distant. "I haven't seen anything of my horse," he said, sounding worried. "I assume you'd recognize him if you saw him, right?" Holmes asked calmly. The colonel was furious. "I've been involved in horse racing for 20 years, and no one has ever asked me such a thing," he exclaimed. "Even a child would know Silver Blaze. He has a white forehead and a mottled mark on his front leg." "What about the betting odds?" Holmes asked, changing the subject. "That's the strange thing," the colonel replied, his frustration growing. "Yesterday, you could have gotten 15-1 odds on him. But the odds have been getting shorter and shorter. Now you can barely get 3-1. Holmes murmured, his eyes narrowing. "Someone knows something. That much is clear." As the carriage stopped near the grandstand, I quickly looked at the race program to see who was running. It read, Wessex Plate, 50 sovereigns, each handicap 4 feet, with 1,000 sovereigns added for 4 and 5-year-olds. Second, £300. Third, £200. New course, 1 mile and 5 furlongs. 1. Mr. Heath Newton's The Negro. Red cap, cinnamon jacket. 2. Colonel Wardlaw's Pugilist. Pink cap, blue and black jacket. 3. Lord Backwater's Desborough. Yellow cap and sleeves. 4. Colonel Ross's Silver Blaze. Black cap, red jacket. 5. Duke of Balmoral's Iris. Yellow and black stripes. 6. Lord Singleford's Rasper. Purple cap, black sleeves. We scratched our other horse and put all our hopes on your word, said the colonel, his voice a mix of desperation and hope. Why, what's that? Silver Blaze favorite? 5-4 against Silver Blaze, the crowd roared, their voices a cacophony of excitement. 5-4 against Silver Blaze. 5-15 against Desborough. 5-4 on the field. There are the odds, I shouted. All 6 horses are in the race. All 6? Then my horse is running, the colonel exclaimed, his voice now full of agitation. But I don't see him. My colors haven't passed. Only 5 have passed. This must be him. As I spoke, a powerful bay horse burst out from the weighing enclosure and galloped past us, bearing the colonel's familiar black and red colors. That's not my horse, the colonel cried. That beast doesn't have a single white hair on its body. What have you done, Mr. Holmes? Well, well, let's see how he does, said Holmes, his voice steady and calm. He peered through my field glasses for a few minutes. Excellent! A fantastic start, he declared suddenly. There they are, rounding the curve. From our carriage, we had a perfect view as the horses came up the straight. They were so close together that you could have covered them with a rug. But halfway up the stretch, the yellow of the Mapleton stable colors took the lead. Before they reached us, however, Desborough's burst of speed faded, and the colonel's horse, surging forward, crossed the finish line a full 6 lengths ahead of its rival. The Duke of Balmoral's Iris, trailing in 3rd. It's my race, anyway, the colonel gasped, wiping his brow. I confess I can't make heads or tails of it. Don't you think you've kept up the mystery long enough, Mr. Holmes? Certainly, Colonel. You'll know everything. Let's all go around and have a look at the horse together. Here he is, Holmes continued, as we made our way into the weighing enclosure, where only owners and their guests were allowed. You just need to wash his face and leg with some spirits of wine, and you'll see he's the same old Silver Blaze. You're taking my breath away. I found him in the hands of a con artist and took the liberty of running him just as he was. My dear sir, you've done wonders. The horse looks very fit and well. He's never been in better shape. I owe you 1,000 apologies for doubting your abilities. You've done me a great service by finding my horse. But you'd do me a greater service if you could catch the murderer of John Straker. I have, said Holmes quietly. The colonel and I stared at him in shock. You've got him? Where is he then? He's here. Here? Where? In my company at this very moment. The colonel flushed angrily. I realize I owe you a debt, Mr. Holmes, he said stiffly, but I have to say I consider what you've just said to be either a terrible joke or an insult. Sherlock Holmes chuckled. I assure you I'm not accusing you of the crime, Colonel, he said. The real murderer is standing right behind you. He stepped past the colonel and placed his hand on the sleek neck of the thoroughbred. The horse? Both the colonel and I cried out. Yes, The horse! And it might lessen his guilt if I tell you that it was in self-defense and that John Straker was a man who was completely unworthy of your trust. But there goes the bell. And as I'm going to place a bet on this next race, I'll save the long explanation for a more suitable time. We had the corner of a Pullman car all to ourselves as we sped back to London that evening. I imagine the journey seemed short to both the Colonel and me, as we listened to our companion's account of the events that had taken place at the Dartmoor training stables on Monday night, and how he had unraveled them. I confess, Holmes said, that any theories I had from reading the newspaper reports were completely wrong. And yet, the clues were there, hidden by other details that obscured their true meaning. I went to Devonshire convinced that Fitzroy Simpson was the real culprit, although I knew the evidence against him wasn't completely solid. It was while I was in the carriage, just as we reached the trainer's house, that the real importance of the curried mutton hit me. You may remember that I was lost in thought and stayed seated after everyone else got out. I was trying to figure out how I could have missed such an obvious clue. I confess, said the Colonel, that even now, I don't see how it helps us. It was the first link in my chain of reasoning. Powdered opium isn't completely tasteless. It doesn't taste bad, but you can tell it's there. If it were mixed with any ordinary dish, the person eating it would definitely notice it, and probably wouldn't eat any more. Curry was exactly the right thing to hide the taste. There's no way that stranger, Fitzroy Simpson, could have arranged for curry to be served at the trainer's house that night, and it's too much of a coincidence to think that he just happened to be there with powdered opium on the very night they were serving a dish that would hide the taste. That's impossible. So, Simpson is out of the picture, and we have to focus on Straker and his wife, the only two people who could have chosen curried mutton for supper that night. The opium was added after the dish was set aside for the stable boy, because everyone else ate the same thing and was fine. So, which one of them had a chance to get to that dish without the maid seeing them? Before I figured that out, I understood the importance of the dog being quiet. One true deduction always leads to others. The Simpson incident showed me that they kept a dog at the stables, but even though someone went in and took a horse out, the dog didn't bark loud enough to wake the two boys in the loft. That means the person who visited in the middle of the night was someone the dog knew well. I was already sure, or almost sure, that John Straker went to the stables in the middle of the night and took Silver Blaze. Why? For something dishonest, obviously. Why else would he drug his own stable boy? But I didn't understand why he would do it. There have been cases where trainers have made a lot of money by betting against their own horses, using someone else, and then making sure the horse loses by cheating. Sometimes it's a jockey who doesn't try hard enough. Sometimes it's something more clever and subtle. What was it here? I hoped the things in his pockets would help me figure it out. And they did. You can't have forgotten the strange knife they found in the dead man's hand, a knife that no sensible person would choose as a weapon. It was, as Dr. Watson pointed out, a kind of knife used for the most delicate operations in surgery. And it was used for a delicate operation that night. You know, with your experience in racing, Colonel Ross, that you can make a small cut on a horse's hamstring, just below the skin, so that there's no trace. A horse treated that way would get a slight limp, which would be blamed on a strain in training or a touch of rheumatism, but never on foul play. "Villain! Scoundrel!" the colonel shouted, his anger flaring. Now we understand why John Straker wanted to take the horse out on the moor. Such a spirited creature would have definitely woken even the deepest sleeper if it felt the prick of the knife. He had to do it in the open air. "I was blind," cried the colonel. Of course, that's why he needed the candle and struck the match. Undoubtedly. But when I examined his belongings, I was lucky enough to find out not just how the crime was done, but also why. You know the world, Colonel, and you know that men don't carry other people's bills around in their pockets. Most of us have enough trouble paying our own bills. I immediately figured that Straker was leading a double life, keeping a second family. The bill showed he was involved with a woman who had expensive tastes. As generous as you are with your servants, you can't expect them to be able to buy 20 guinea dresses for their ladies. I asked Mrs. Straker about the dress without letting her know I was doing it, and after I was sure that she hadn't received it, I noted the dressmaker's address and figured that if I went there with Straker's picture, I could easily uncover the fictional Derbyshire. From that point on, everything was clear. Straker had led the horse to a hollow where his light wouldn't be seen. Simpson, when he ran away, dropped his scarf, and Straker picked it up, maybe thinking he could use it to tie up the horse's leg. Once in the hollow, he got behind the horse and lit a match. But the horse, spooked by the sudden light and with the animal instinct that something was wrong, kicked out, and its iron shoe hit Straker right on the forehead. He had already taken off his coat, despite the rain, to do his job, so when he fell, his knife cut his thigh. Is that clear? Incredible, the colonel exclaimed. Amazing! You could have been there. My last guess, I confess, was a long shot. I figured that a man as clever as Straker wouldn't try to cut the tendon without a little practice. What could he practice on? My eyes fell on the sheep, and I asked a question that, to my surprise, confirmed my suspicion. When I returned to London, I visited the dressmaker, who recognized Straker as a good customer named Derbyshire, who had a very stylish wife with a fondness for expensive dresses. I'm sure that woman got him deeply in debt, which led him to this terrible plan. You've explained everything except one thing, the colonel said. Where was the horse? Ah, he bolted and was taken care of by one of your neighbors. I think we need to grant them an amnesty. Is this Clapham Junction by any chance? We'll be at Victoria in less than 10 minutes. If you'd like to have a cigar in our rooms, Colonel, I'd be happy to tell you any other details that might interest you. The end. If you like the story, hit that like button and subscribe for more videos. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Was there anything that surprised you? Who's your favorite character in the story? I can't wait to hear your thoughts.